This weekend is an annual weekend that we do every year called Missions Weekend, and it's where we really highlight missions, the missions work of the church, and invite you as an opportunity to just participate with us in supporting those missions. But you know that theme of missions is actually very common in a lot of our stories, and some of the best movies really center around the idea of mission. You think about Lord of the Rings, right? The mission was for Frodo the ring bearer to get the ring to Mordor so he could destroy the ring in the fires of Mount Doom. Or Saving Private Ryan, right? Private James Ryan, whose 3 older brothers were killed in action during World War II, he was stuck behind enemy lines, and so they send this group in order to bring, the army sends this group in order to bring him home so his mom doesn't have 4 dead sons and she has a son to be restored. Or Braveheart, right? William Wallace, is leading these Scotsmen to make war against England and the oppressive reign of King Longshanks in order to bring freedom to the Scottish people. Avengers Infinity War. The Avengers were trying to keep Thanos from getting the Infinity Stones. Spoiler alert, they failed that mission. You think about Goonies, right? The mission in Goonies was to find One-Eyed Willie's treasure and save their town, right? It was a great movie. The list actually could go on and on. There's so many movies that really, and even just our great stories, and you think about even works of antiquity, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey and the Epic of Gilgamesh and all these stories that go way back in totally different cultures that all have in them this idea of mission. Something, a greater purpose, a greater mission to live for that's willing to risk it all in order to accomplish the mission. And there's a reason that those stories resonate with us. There's a reason that really across people groups and across everybody has these stories of these epic adventures, these epic missions. And the reason is because it actually echoes something spiritually that God has woven into our hearts, that He in His creation has put into our souls, because He's actually called us into a mission. He's called us into participating with Him and joining with Him in a great mission that's not made up. It's not a myth. It's actually true, and it's what you were made for and what you were designed for. He gives us this mission in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 14. It says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." It says that the earth there's going to be a day that's going to come. The earth is going to be so filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord that it'll be like the waters that cover the sea, right? And you think about how much underwater exploration we've been able to do, and we've been able to go down into the Mariana Trench and see miles down, right? But you think about in antiquity, they didn't have any of that information. They just knew, man, you go out a little bit past the waves and you can't touch the bottom, right? It's deep out there. And if you get caught in the middle of the ocean, you're not coming back. And so the idea that the earth would be filled in such a deep way, that they're so deep of a knowledge of God, they're so deep of a knowledge of His glory, they would fill the entire earth. That is the mission that God has called us to. You fast forward to the New Testament, and Jesus, He tells us how this mission is going to be accomplished. He says in Matthew 28, 18, and 20, after He had died on the cross, He'd been resurrected from the dead, pretty much right before He ascends into heaven, He says to His disciples, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the age." You have to think about how crazy this scenario is. Jesus, he lived His entire life in the area of Judea. And He never even went beyond the borders. And if you think about Judea from a geopolitical standpoint, it was never one of the great empires of the world. It was never one of the most important places. Think about, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, or the Egyptian Empire, but Israel was never one of those. But He says, I want you to take this mission, my teaching, the knowledge of the glory of God, I want you to spread out across the entire world, and I want you to make disciples of all the nations. For this group of guys, they had been walking with Jesus, this group of disciples, a very small group. They've been walking with Jesus for 3 years, and like a revolutionary 3 years, a life-changing 3 years. They had walked with the Master and been discipled by Him, but when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, 3 years is not that long. I don't know how much you can soak in 3 years. I'm still learning stuff every single day, and I've been on staff here for 24 years. So I think of all the things I've learned over the years, and then just you shrink that down into 3 years, man, and it wasn't like Jesus was working with the cream of the crop, okay? These weren't the graduates of the best seminaries who all graduated summa cum laude or something, okay? These were like kind of bums. Like these were like fishermen who weren't the smartest, they weren't the best, they weren't the quickest on the uptake, okay? And the Bible is full, the Gospels are full of them making mistakes and getting it wrong and thinking Jesus is saying one thing and it being totally different, right? They're constantly like just kind of discombobulated. And so, and their expectation is that Jesus is going to come, he's going to set up an earthly kingdom, and that he's going to be the actual king, and they're going to be like his cabinet, his vassals, right? But he says, no, that's actually not what's going to happen. He dies on the cross, and he resurrects from the dead, and then he ascends into heaven very shortly after that. But he just gives them this last instruction. Okay, I want you to go into all the world. Now I want you to take this message, and I want you to make disciples of all the nations. Now I want you to just imagine you're one of those disciples. You go to sleep that night, you wake up the next day, now what do? Like, what's your next move? You would have no idea. You would have no clue. Like, I don't know how we go take this message to the nations, right? It's not like he left them like a real clear, they didn't even have the Bible. He didn't leave them a real clear instruction manual on how you're supposed to do this. He said, go and do it. He just gave them this little instruction. He said, I want you to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. Okay, that's actually a little bit helpful, but not super helpful. And then he says, I want you to wait here in Jerusalem until I send the helper. And so then they waited in Jerusalem. That's when we talked about earlier that the Holy Spirit came into the upper room and began to empower them to go out and just proclaim the gospel and mimic the ministry that Jesus had done with signs and wonders and miracles and pray for sick people and just begin to expand that ministry. And to the point where we read in Acts 17, that's Paul's third missionary journey, which took place around 49 AD, okay? Now, Jesus was ascended into heaven around 33 AD. So this is about 16 years later, okay? So it's been about 16 years of them on mission. Let's see how it was going. In verse 1, it says, now when they had traveled through Epiphalis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, and according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I'm proclaiming to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of the God-fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. So here's what they did. Paul began to go across the Mediterranean area, and this is in modern-day Greece, and Thessalonica is still a city that you can go to today. And he goes to this city, and as is his custom, there had already been a diaspora of the Jews, and so the Jews had already spread out across the world, and so there's a synagogue there, right? And he goes to the synagogue, he begins to reason with the Jews from the Old Testament Scriptures, and he begins to show them how God has been prophesying about the Messiah, and that the Messiah has come, his name is Jesus, and this is the good news, that you can be saved because he died on the cross for your sins. And begins to reason with them from the Scriptures, and many of them begin to believe. And not just them, many of the Greeks begin to believe too, and many of the leading women of the city. But, it says in verse 5, but the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And attacking the house of Jason was their host, he was a citizen of that city, says they were seeking to bring them out to the people. When they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some of the brethren before the authorities, shouting, these men who have upset the whole world have come here also. And Jason has welcomed them. And they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, King Jesus. Okay, there's so much to unpack here. I just want to highlight one thing. The claim that they make against Jason and those of his household is that these men who have upset the whole world have come here also. Okay, the gospel had not yet come to Thessalonica. But they had heard of what was happening in other cities around around Turkey and Greece, and it had come to them that so many people were converting and becoming Christians and were transforming their lives that it began to cause all kinds of trouble and all kinds of problems. And now those men have come to our city and causing trouble here because they're claiming that there is another king than Caesar, King Jesus. And you notice it says that the Jews who became jealous, they went to the marketplace and grabbed some evil men. The reason is because when the gospel would begin to take root in a city, it would disrupt the economy. Because in the marketplace, a lot of the tradesmen had built this market around pagan worship. And so they made idols, and they made little things for people to worship, and little statues and all this kind of stuff. And as people became converted to Christianity, they found out that God is a jealous God, and that idolatry is wicked, and that God didn't want them to worship other gods. And so they wouldn't buy those anymore. And it actually caused the sales of those men to go down. And it was a real problem. So these men have a vested interest. So they come before the king. They say, these men who upset the whole world, who are causing problems everywhere. So we find out that only 16 short years after Jesus, it had already gone, that the ripples of the revival that was happening and people converting to Christianity was spreading out through the entire world. We know that some of those apostles went down into North Africa and began to proclaim the gospel there, and it took root in Alexandria and Egypt, and many people were converted there. We know here in El Cajon, we have a large Chaldean population. And the Chaldeans believe that Peter came into Iraq and Baghdad and Persia and began to proclaim the gospel there, and that's how their people were originally saved, and that people, Paul and the Apostle Paul went up into Greece and onto Rome and then on to Spain and proclaimed the gospel there, and then their disciples began to go into Western Europe and Eastern Europe and proclaim the gospel there, and then they were converted, and then they would send, the Western Europeans would send missionaries back down to Europe, back down to like Rome, who now had been taken over by barbarians, and began to minister to them. And they sent evangelists and missionaries over to the United States of America. This is like George Whitefield during the First Great Awakening, and proclaiming the gospel to the people that were just establishing the new world here. And you think about our own mission history with Junipero Serra, the Franciscan monk who came over, and he walked up and down the West Coast establishing missions and evangelizing the native peoples here. And then you think about how the gospel took root in America, and then we sent missionaries out to Asia and out to Africa, and people began to be converted there. And then now they're sending missionaries back to Europe, because Europe has begun to secularize. And it's just been this way for the entire world, the gospel taking root everywhere. It's kind of like if you look at those maps with like the trade winds, where there's just arrows pointing everywhere. That's how the gospel has gone throughout the entire earth for the last 2,000 years. And it's actually going to continue to go like that until the whole earth is filled with the knowledge of God. And not just a little bit of knowledge of God, but the deep knowledge of God. And this isn't in my notes, and I don't want to get too into it this morning because I don't have a lot of time. I preached this message on Saturday night, and it was an hour. So I'm going to try to save you guys from that, okay? But this is one of the reasons why I don't think that Jesus is coming back anytime soon. Now, I think we should live our life like that and surprise a lot of people, because most people are like thinking, when I got saved, I read all the Left Behind books, and I was ready for Jesus going to come back anytime, and I was trying to figure out who the Antichrist was and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is, I think we're still in this process where God is filling the entire earth with the knowledge and the glory of God, and that's going to take a really long time. And so we're in this process. So here's what the reality is for us. The reality is that God has invited us to participate in that process, in that mission that he's given the church. And so we are surrounded by so many hundreds and hundreds of years of faithful missionaries and faithful witnesses who sacrificed and who labored and who worked hard, and we get to join them and run our part of the race. So Jesus told a parable in Matthew 13:31. It says, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in the field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air can come and take nests in its branches. It starts in such a small little way, but the kingdom is like that little tiny seed that grows into a giant tree, the biggest tree in all the garden. And that's what we've been, that process of missions and that process of the gospel taking root across the world. Now, this morning, I want to share with you kind of 3 principles that we as a church want to apply when it comes to missions. These are 3 principles that if we want to be impactful as a church in missions, these are 3 things that we believe that God has called us to do. The first is very simple. We want to be faithful. We want to be faithful what it is that God has called us to. John 3:8 says, the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but do not know where it comes from or where it is going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. This is Jesus trying to explain to Nicodemus what it's like to be born again by the Spirit of God. That actually the Spirit of God is hard to discern sometimes. If you ever try to figure out what God's plan is, that is kind of an exercise in futility, okay? Because rarely does God ever give you the whole plan. God will just give you a piece, and he says, be faithful with this. Start with this. And so he's constantly just revealing his will and his desire for us in these small little ways so we can try to discern and learn what it is that God is teaching us. And so the Spirit of God begins to move. But how it works is that God opens doors sometimes and opportunities. And he's seeing, will you be faithful with that? Will you take a step of faith? And so when it comes to missions, one of our desires is that we would be faithful with the doors that God opens to us as a church. With the way that he leads us, right? You remember the disciples were in the upper room, right? And the Holy Spirit came, and then that's what compelled them to go out, is we want to be filled with the Spirit of God when it comes to our plan for missions. Is that the opportunities that God gives us, the doors that God opens, we want to walk through them. You know, the Bible says in Luke 28:48, it says, "For everyone who's been given much, much will be required, and to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more." We believe that if we're faithful in the small things, God is going to open up and give us more opportunities to be faithful. But we have to be faithful. And if you're given much, much is going to be expected of you. You know, as you sit here this morning, you look across just our assembly, our church, right? The church that God has given to us. Do you realize how many faithful people have gone before us to make this possible today? You know, when I came on staff 24 years ago, and I got involved in ministry probably 26 years ago. And when I got involved in ministry, I came into the junior high ministry, the youth ministry that had already been established. You know, Pastor Mark started the junior high ministry at this church. And then Pastor John took it over, and I worked for John and helped him. But when I came, there was already like rules, and there was already something going, and it was like I could just come in and run this ministry that had already been started. It's like someone who goes and he shows up and he sees a farm and he says, "This place is great. This place will be great for growing plants," right? But you know, there was somebody who showed up and they didn't see a farm, they saw a field with a bunch of tumbleweeds, right? And they had to start laboring and building and digging up the hard ground in order to prepare the ground for a harvest. And the truth is that most of us in here, we weren't here when a lot of the really hard work was done to establish this church. But we're here now. We are inheritors of other people's faithfulness. So in many ways, we stand on the shoulders of giants. People have gone before us that labored faithfully. And now the question is, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to be faithful with the part that God has given to us? Are we going to be faithful to continue on the work of what it is that God has given to us? And so that's part of what we want to accomplish in missions. We want to be faithful with the position that God has put us in. We want to be faithful in that part. 3 John 1:6-8. 3 John is one of those books of the Bible that just has one chapter. And so just verse 6-8, it says, "And they have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. For they went out for the sake of the name, Jesus, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support such men so that we may be fellow workers with the truth." You know, when you think about missions, most people are not called to go to the third world, to go to a foreign nation and live as a missionary there. Most people aren't called. You're called to be faithful right here where you're at, to work the job, to raise the family, to work on the relationships that you have, and that's what God has called you to do. But that doesn't mean that we get to wash our hands of the duty to foreign missions. In fact, it says here, it says we would do well, talking about sending out missionaries, it says we do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. You know what he's talking about there? He's talking about money. He's saying you should give them the support so that they can go out, and not just support, but support that is worthy of God, so they can go out and do the mission. Then it says, "For they went out for the sake of the name of Jesus, accepting nothing from the Gentiles," because the people they went to, they didn't want to say, hey, you know, Paul made it very clear. Pastors and preachers and missionaries are worthy of support. There's nothing wrong with a pastor taking a salary, okay? But he said, Paul, also the same Paul, he said, when I went out, I was a tent maker because I didn't want money to be the issue of the people that I was trying to evangelize and the people I was trying to speak to. So the same way, when they went out to the Gentiles, he's saying, let the church, the believing church, support those missionaries so the people that they're going to don't have to be supported. So that's not a stumbling block for them. And then he says, therefore, we ought to support such men so that we may be fellow workers with the truth. That's the most important part that I want you to get. So that God might not have called me specifically to go out there, but in my supporting of him, of missionaries, that I become a fellow worker with them. And we now are out there ministering and trying to win the nations and proclaim the gospel because I am supporting them through my giving. And so the first principle we want to, just to maximize our impact, is we want to be faithful with the opportunities that God gives us. The second thing is this, is we want to be strategic. We want to be strategic. You know, one of the things you hear about when it comes to missions that is really upsetting is that, and when I was a youth pastor, I used to get these invitations all the time for people to say, bring your youth group down to Mexico and have them build houses and stuff. And you just think like, these guys can't clean their own rooms. I'm not sure you want them building a house, you know? And you hear these stories about these groups that go down to Mexico and they build a house, and then after they leave, they have to have some people come fix everything that they built because it's all built like a 14-year-old built it, you know? And then they have the next group come down, and it actually is just this like kind of hustle. It's this way to make you feel good, like you're doing something valuable, but you're not actually doing anything that actually makes an impact. We don't want to do stuff just for us. We don't want to do stuff that makes us feel good. We want to do stuff that actually has an impact in the kingdom. So when you came in here today, you should have gotten this little pamphlet. If you want to take that out real quick, it says, because of you, lives are changed on the front. But if you turn it over, these are a list of some of the missions and the ministries that we support as a church. And one of our goals is to say, not only, God, you've opened the door for us to support this missions, is that we want to make, we have two questions. We have first, what is their theology? Is this a ministry that values and holds fast to the Word of God? That's our first qualification for us to support a mission. The second thing for us to support a ministry is that, is this person who's in leadership, can they be trusted? Are they tested? Does God have a calling on their life, and has their character been tested? And so we only support ministries in our church of people that, one, have theology that values the Bible, and two, are ministries run by people who have been tested. And so as you look across this list, there's so many things in here that are people that AS Bible Institute in India. That's Michael Arun, who's come here and he preached a couple years ago. He's a guy we've known for years. The way we first got involved with him is somebody had given him Pastor Mark's book, and he reached out to Pastor Mark, and he said, this is amazing. Can you teach me more about this? And he has a ministry school there where he raises up and teaches pastors to go out and start church plants. You think about Generation Changers. That's a ministry that helps churches and trains churches and trains people to lead youth ministry and children's ministry in places where they're not there. It's run by Becky Blesh. Becky Blesh was John Hoffman's assistant in the youth ministry for like 7 years. She's one of us. She got saved at this church, and now she's out there doing missions across the world. You think about Samaritan Aviation in Papua New Guinea. That's Matt Condon and his family. He was a homicide detective for San Diego PD, and he felt like God was calling him to go to learn to fly planes, so he went and got his pilot license in order that he could go to Papua New Guinea and fly medical trips up and down the rivers there with people that have never been exposed to this kind of thing in order to share the love of Christ with them by actually meeting their actual needs there. Matt Condon was a part of our church for many, many, many years. He got discipled here. And just the list goes on and on. So we want to be strategic. We want to make sure that the people we're supporting are part of a larger project that is going to be sustainable and long-term. In the same way, all the ministries we support is we want to be able to have ongoing relationship with them. Not just like we go there once and we never see them again. But we want to be able to, like Marty runs our Cuba ministry. That was started over 20 years ago, and we've had a major impact in Cuba. And regularly, there's these Cuban pastors, and we're in communication, we're talking to them and walking through really tens and hundreds of people there. They come here and they visit us, and we're able to carry on this ongoing relationship of love and support that has been used by God in massive ways. So we want to be faithful and want to be strategic. And the last thing is, the third principle is we want to be generous. I want to be generous. You know, as a pastor, oftentimes when it comes to money, we don't want to, it's like one of those things you kind of don't want to talk about. Because you know there's so many people who have hang-ups about money. And if you haven't picked up on by now, we're talking about money today. So, but you know, so often it's like, I don't want to lay a stumbling block. I don't want to. There's this kind of picture out there that the church is greedy, and we're just, and there are people out there who are trying to sell stuff, and there's a handful of pastors who are getting rich, but by and large, I want to tell you that most pastors, they're not getting rich, they're not making a ton of money. We're not after your money. in some kind of way. But the problem with if we just decide, okay, we're just not going to talk about money, we're just not going to touch that. The problem is that the Bible has a lot to say about money. And if we really believe that this is God's direction for us on right living, and this is going to lead us to life, if we don't talk about money, then we're ripping people off. We're not preaching the full counsel of God. And so the reality is the Bible has a lot to say about generosity. You know, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, the Apostle Paul is trying to encourage the Corinthians, who are by and large a wealthy church, to give very generously to the people, to the mission of the church in Jerusalem, who was suffering very greatly. And he's saying, look, even the Macedonians who are very poor, they have given above and beyond what their measure was. And this is what he says to the Corinthians. He says in verse 6 of chapter 9, he says, now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And he said, here's the principle, that if you just give a little bit, you're just going to get a little bit out of it. But if you give a lot, if you sow bountifully, you're going to reap bountifully. He's saying that the more you sow, the more God is going to honor that, and the more that God is going to bless you. Now, look, we abhor the prosperity gospel. We don't preach the prosperity gospel. And I'm not telling you that if you give a lot of money that God is going to bless you financially. But what I am telling you is that God is going to be faithful to you. This is Jesus' words. He says in Luke 6:38, give, it will be given to you. They will pour out in your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. That God is calling us to be faithful and to be generous above and beyond. And test God in this. See if he doesn't give back to you. Now, listen, as I'm preaching to you guys, but I'm also just we as a church want to act that way. You know, in the last year and a half, as Neil and I have taken on more leadership, one of the things that I've gotten exposed to is more how the financial situation around the church works. And I want to tell you, one of my jobs is I oversee our missions giving. And our church is the most generous when it comes to missions and helping other churches. We regularly have needs come in from other churches and needs come in from other missions. And regularly we're coming up and we'll be in a meeting and Mark and Dave will say, well, how much do you guys want to give? And early on, especially Neil and I were, how about this much? And they're like, no, we're not even considering amount that low. We got to give twice, 3 times, 4 times that much money. Because regularly we want to honor God and be generous as a church, because what we believe is that if we sow bountifully, we're going to reap bountifully. And I want to tell you, that's the principle this church is run by. If you look around, you see, man, God has been so faithful to us. One of the reasons is because we have sowed bountifully as a church. We have been generous in our giving. And so when it comes to the principles of how do we want to maximize our impact in missions, we want to be faithful, we want to be strategic, and we want to be generous. And that brings me to this morning where I want to highlight 3 opportunities we have to do that. 3 opportunities that we have to invite you. These are 3 missions that we've identified as the opportunity we have to be the most impactful, to make the biggest difference. And these are 3 ministries most of you will be familiar with because they're 3 of the largest ministries we support: Youth Venture, Guatemala, and Youth Venture East Africa. And what we have found is, what we decided several years ago, is that we believe God has opened a door that is bigger than what we could just support from our regular budget. And so we invited the church. We've been doing this for years now. We've invited the church to come and support these ministries on a monthly basis by just saying, above your tithe in your offering, would you be willing to support these ministries financially so that we can continue on and expand what it is that God has called us to do? I want to highlight those 3 ministries, and I want to start with Youth Venture. So let's go ahead and run that Youth Venture video.
Youth Venture has been doing ministry in East County for over 30 years now. Through these centers, we have had countless stories of students being impacted through the truth and love that our volunteers share. If you just look around Foothills, you will see person after person from every walk of life that has been reached through Youth Venture. 2 of our current site directors and myself were first exposed to the gospel because of Youth Venture. And now we have the honor of guiding these teenagers along the same path that we once walked. Today, Youth Venture operates 4 individual teen centers in Santee, El Cajon, and Lakeside. At the center, students are invited not just into a teen center to have fun, but into a family. What sets Youth Venture apart is that unlike so many other programs and nonprofits, we offer a real solution to the core issues in a youth's life. We don't just try to treat the symptoms, but we help them to discover their real purpose in life. Our entire purpose behind Youth Venture is to be able to meet our students where they are, share the love of God with them, and share the good news that there is hope in Christ. Our goal is to train them and raise them to become faithful disciples of Jesus. Throughout these centers, we've reached over 100 individual students weekly and can do over 40 lessons a week. All this is possible because of the faithfulness of our volunteers and the faithfulness of those of you who are willing to financially support our centers.
You know, Youth Venture is the ministry that most of you are the most familiar with. Many of you have been giving to Youth Venture for years. Many of you have been serving at Youth Venture for years. You know that they can be some of the most difficult and yet some of the most rewarding ministry of this church has come out of Youth Venture. I want to talk to you about the origin story real quick. The year was 1992, and Foothills was a little tiny church. This is in the early days of Foothills. We'd come together, these two really small churches, and formed one church. And we were meeting, after a series of meeting in a few other buildings, we'd come to meet in this building. It was a little corner of the building over there. Where you are now was the Union Tribune Distribution Center. And it was a little corner of that building. And our sanctuary was there. And we began to sense, Mark and Dave specifically began to sense that God was calling us to reach out specifically to children and youth. God was giving us a burden that we saw so many kids who were struggling here in East County, and we wanted to find a way to reach them. And so the thing that came to their mind seemed like a best strategy was to have a couple guys run for school boards in order to get in the school board, one in La Mesa School Board, one Lakeside School Board, in order to use that opportunity to reach out to kids in public school. And it ended up kind of catching on in the news, and it became this big scandal, like this, right-wing Christian takeover of the schools and the school boards. And there was one meeting in particular that was, it was like a town hall meeting, the kind of school board town hall meeting that nobody ever goes to, like two little old ladies. And yet there was hundreds of people showed up. And it was national news organizations were all coming to tell this story about how there was this big, extremist kind of takeover in the school boards. And Mark was just so grieved, and he could see the writing on the wall, like, dude, there's so much stacked against us. We're not going to win these. And all we want to do, our heart, is just to help kids. We just want to help struggling kids. And he was in the sanctuary praying, and he said that God just gave him the idea. It was like he just gave him the idea of Youth Venture, just kind of downloaded the picture, gave him faith for it, and he gave him this scripture. Isaiah 42, verse 3, a bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. As we just looked across and we saw all these kids, many of them latchkey kids, many of them discarded. The system had failed them. East County had largely been a place for apartment buildings, single moms. A lot of these kids had both parents working. They came from unsafe homes, and they were just out on the streets, and there was kids just all over the place. And God gave me this idea of what if we had just have a teen center where kids can come and they can be encouraged and they can be strengthened. We could share the gospel with them and make a difference. And so we were able to do a bunch of fundraisers and sell T-shirts and sell Christmas trees and anything we could think of. We're a little tiny church without a lot of resources. But we ended up, there's a building right across the bridge here on Graves, right next to that 7-Eleven. There's a little office building. They were able to rent a little tiny part of that building. I think it was like 600 square feet. It was hardly anything. We just kind of bootstrapped together some pool table and video games, and Mark used to go around with these tickets that say like free play at the arcade games and give them to people wherever you find kids on the street. When I was coming here last night, I ran into a guy who got saved from that Youth Venture, and he's raising his family here, and this is 30, over 30 years ago. And then I remember, it was a few years later. And there was a kid named Andy Williams who ended up shooting up Santana School and killed some people. It was a big story. And I remember I was in a prayer meeting with Pastor Mark, and he was like, what if we had had a Youth Venture in Santee? What if we could have gotten to that kid before he made such a terrible decision? And that's when we really just felt like, okay, we're going to open a Youth Venture in Santee. And then we opened a Youth Venture in Lakeside and a Youth Venture in another one in El Cajon. And God had given us this building over here on Broadway, and we began to expand and open up the opportunities. Today we have our former director, Jeremy Miller. He runs a ministry called Visit that helps other churches start youth ventures. And it's just been this opportunity, this door that God opened, and it has been so fruitful for us. You think about like just that verse, right? A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly lit wick he will not extinguish. You think about even just this morning, Brianna, who was leading us in worship, right? She's got the best voice on the worship team. It's just true. She has the best voice on the worship team. Sorry to everybody else. Brianna, she came from Youth Venture. When she was growing up as a little girl, her mom died of alcoholism. Her dad was really sick, and she was her primary caretaker, and she had a really rough life. And a friend invited her one day to come to Youth Venture, and she came there, and she met a woman named Brooke Steckler, who wasn't even Brooke Steckler at the time. And she began to just pour into her and mentor her and tell her about the good news of Jesus Christ. And she heard it and received it. She got saved, and she's been in this church ever since. She met her husband here, and she serves us all the time. It's an amazing story. I was teaching my home fellowship. It was a Bible study I lead on Wednesday night, and my friend Thomas was there, and he came up at the end. He said, that reminds me of that first Youth Venture lesson, So What, Who Cares? And So What, Who Cares is our very first lesson in Youth Venture, and the answer to that question is a lot of kids are walking around, so what, who cares? And they've been told that nobody cares. And the answer that the lesson gives them is that God cares, that you're made for a purpose and he sees you and knows you. And in the Bible study, he was just like, yeah, it reminds me of that first Youth Venture lesson. I was like, oh, you remember from leading kids through it? And he said, no, I remember it from the first time I went through it. I met Thomas when he was in 6th grade. He came here, his friends invited him to church, and he was causing problems, and they were throwing trash at each other. I said, hey, you guys need to stop and pick up 20 pieces of trash. And I remember the death stare that Thomas gave me. He hated my guts, and he was not going to do it. And so we sat there and stared at each other for a little bit, and finally I convinced him to do it. But he was an angry little kid. What I didn't know is that his dad had recently died. His mom was disabled and was unable to care for him, so he was living on the floor of a friend's house in Lakeside. They were stealing his Social Security money, and he was living on the floor with about 14 other people in a cockroach-infested apartment. No, of course this kid was angry. And he's just this little bruised reed and a dimly lit wick. And yet that guy today, he owns his own plumbing company. He's a father. He married an amazing woman here, Talia, and he serves in our church. And there's story after story after story of God coming and rescuing these kids that are just a barely flickering wick. And you give them a minute and you allow God to minister them, and they begin to grow, and the flame begins to get brighter to the point where it's not a dimly lit wick anymore. It's a bright fire that God has done, and God has used Youth Venture to bring about those things. We don't have a lot of time, so I want to go on and tell you about our next ministry, which is Guatemala. Let's go ahead and run that video.
Foothills Church has been doing annual medical trips to Guatemala for over 10 years. On these mission trips, doctors, dentists, nurses, and translators from Foothills help provide desperately need medical and dental care free of charge to some of the poorest and most needy in Guatemala. We have been able to supply tens of thousands of dollars worth of medicine, vitamins, and medical equipment to people in need. What started as an annual mission trips has turned into a year-round Foothills medical clinic in Guatemala. Last year, we were able to open a full-time clinic in the neighborhood of Magdalena Milpas Altas. The clinic is open 4 days a week, with 2 days dedicated to medical care and 2 days dedicated to dental care. The clinic specializes in giving medical care to severely disabled children and adults. This life-giving care could not happen if it wasn't for your kindness and generosity. God has used Foothills Church to make a major impact in the lives of some of the most needy people in Guatemala. Thank you for the investment in these lives, and thank you for being faithful to God so our clinic and this service can continue. God bless you all.
Now, I'm not sure if you could understand what he was saying. Just kidding. That's my friend Carlos over there, and I like making fun of his accent. But Carlos, Carlos was born in Guatemala. Him and his wife are Guatemalan. Carlos was a professional soccer player in Guatemala, and they immigrated to the United States. And Carlos, he wanted to go back and build like a home for his family, like a vacation home that they could, go vacation back there and go back and visit Guatemala every once in a while. So he did that. And he was over there, and he needed to furnish the house. And there's a neighborhood somewhat close by to his neighborhood that is kind of well known for their ability to make cabinets and woodworking and stuff. And so he went there to try to buy some of the things for his house. And he was driving along he couldn't find it, right? This is dirt roads. It's third world. It's outside of Antigua, which is a beautiful city, but it's very rural and very poor. And so he pulls up to a police officer and he's asking directions. The police officer says, like, yeah, it's down that way. And there's this little guy crossing the road. His name's Victor. And he starts yelling at the police officer, like, hey, man, you're a civil servant. Like, you got to do better. Should give him better directions than that. Like, take more time to take care of this guy. And he says to Carlos, like, hey, I can give you directions if you want to go. And so he gets in the car and they begin to just talk. And he finds out that Victor's a Christian. And he ends up telling him about these kids that he helps support, these severely disabled kids. And Carlos is able to meet some of those kids, and they're you just think about like severely disabled people in dirt floor type poverty, how hard it is to keep them from getting other kinds of diseases and keep sterile environments and protect them even from being taken advantage of and all this kind of stuff. And he found these people that are like in wheelbarrows, right? That can't walk, but they have no way of getting around. And so he says, what we actually need is some wheelchairs. And so Carlos says, well, I want to try to help with that. And he comes back to the States. He starts calling friends and family and people and can help with this. He comes to the church, and we say, yeah, we'll double whatever you do. Like we'll join you in that. And we're able to end up getting these kids some wheelchairs down there. And it actually starts this ministry that Carlos's heart is just for. It's called the Merlot Foundation, that works with these disabled kids, that helps feed them and bring food to them every week. And that guy, Victor, that original guy who he just randomly met on the street, is now helps us run our medical clinic and helps run the Merlot Foundation down in Guatemala. It was this door that God just opened to us. And so for 10 years, we've been going down and doing these medical clinics. And a year and a half ago, Neil and I were able to go down to help open a full-time clinic. It's the Foothills Clinic. It's not supported by anybody else. It's just our church that supports this clinic that has 2 days a week a doctor and 2 days a week a dentist that is able to provide really necessary medical care and prayer and support and encouragement for people who otherwise would never be able to receive it. We want to keep that ministry going. I run out of time, so I want to show you our last ministry, which is Youth Venture East Africa.
There is something beautiful when you witness God's love for young people being accomplished on the other side of the world. You come to realize there are hundreds of thousands of people needing to know the love of the Father over there, just as there are in our own backyard. Youth Venture has done an incredible job stateside ministering to young people where they're at, in their neighborhoods, at the skate parks, nearby the schools, and at local parks. And for the past 20 years, Youth Venture has seen tremendous growth and opportunity in East Africa, specifically in Kenya and Uganda. In less than a decade, YV East Africa has doubled in the number of schools hosting a Bible club, plus expanded to hosting out-of-school clubs. To give it a number, we're ministering to 60,000 to 80,000 students each week in over 250 clubs. And the qualitative impact is just as impressive. Thanks to Youth Venture, many of these schools and communities are seeing higher test scores, lower occurrence of risky behavior, fewer dropouts, and increased attendance at school and at church. To support such a tremendous ministry, YV East Africa relies on the faithful 300 plus volunteers who go by foot or motorbike to minister and teach a Bible lesson to these students. Additionally, Youth Venture East Africa hosts an annual leadership conference that provides ministry training to our volunteers and has a mission trip focused on ministering to the clubs throughout the countries. As we look to the future, we're excited to see YV East Africa implement a student discipleship program, streamline our curriculum, and potentially expand into the African nations of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. Thank you for your support, prayer, and encouragement of Youth Venture East Africa.
The way Youth Venture East Africa started was that Pastor Mark got an invitation by a missionary that runs KMTI, Kenyan Ministry Training Institute. It's a Bible college for pastors down there. And Mark was invited by a friend of Charles Simpson's to come down and to train these pastors in the Bible. And so he went down and he was able to go for a few years. And in 2006, he went down and he taught the Joshua Principle, our basically the book that he wrote on the principles that God has shown us on youth ministry, on how to reach young people and what God has done here at the church. And in that class was a young man named David Kibet, and he was a pastor and a student there. And he went back to his town. It's called Moyben. It's kind of a rural, spread out town. He was an assistant chief. He's the chief now today. But he began to think, man, what could God do if the same thing happened here? And so he went to the headmasters and he said, can I start a club in your school, a Christian club? And they said, yeah, sure. They were desperate for any kind of help. And so he began to do that, and he took some of our Youth Venture mentoring materials and was using those materials in order to lead these clubs and tell these kids about Jesus. And so a few years went by, and he ended up contacting Pastor Mark again. He said, hey, can you send me more materials? And Pastor Mark said, for what? And he said, for the clubs that I'm running. And Mark said, what clubs? Because we had no idea this was even going on to the level that it was going on. So Pastor Mark sent him more of our training material, and he began to expand and open up other clubs. And another pastor that was with him, Felix Aceto, they're our national directors now of KMTI. Over those years, since 2006, it has just grown exponentially. It's actually embarrassing to say the numbers because it's so significant. Jeremy said 60 to 80,000 kids are being reached every single week. But if you talk to Felix and David, they say it's more like 100,000 kids are being ministered to every week through these clubs. We got a video, Pastor Mark and Jeremy forwarded a video to us just yesterday of Felix Aceto, the pastor we work with, one of our directors. He was in Burundi. He had just come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he was on his way to Rwanda, and he's talking to this network of other churches and encouraging them to start clubs, and it looks like they've already started them, and that we're praying that God is going to expand it. When we started this ministry, it was called Youth Venture Kenya. But now it's called Youth Venture East Africa because it's expanding further and further, not just in Kenya, but outside of it. And we have over 400 volunteers that serve in the ministry, and it is radical what God is doing. Would you do me a favor? Would you take out this piece of paper? On the front it says, because of you, lives are changed. And then it gives 3 ministries, the ones we've just highlighted, Youth Venture East Africa, and Guatemala. Our prayer and hope is that you would be willing to join us in saying, I'm committing to supporting these ministries for the next year. We give a little $30 a month suggested donation there, but you don't have to do that. If that's too much for you, you could list any amount you want to give. You can give a one-time gift, you can give weekly, you can give monthly, whatever's most convenient for you, but we just feel like that's a decent target to shoot at. But some of you guys can give a lot more. And some of you guys, God is challenging you to support these in a more significant way. There's a QR code there at the bottom corner. If you click that, you can set up your own online giving. By putting your name here, in a minute I'm going to ask you to fill this out, and this just tells us as a church that you're making a commitment, and that's really important to us to know what we can expect or what we can hope for in the next year in order to support these ministries and how we might even be able to expand these ministries. Many of you in here are already currently giving. If you're comfortable with your current giving amount, if you just check this box, continue my current missions giving, that just tells us you're planning on continuing your pledge that you gave last year to this year. If that's you, you don't have to do anything. We're going to continue to take your money just like we have been. In fact, we're never going to stop that. So if you want it to stop, you're going to have to stop that yourself. The rest of you can sign up online. Or you can, like I said, QR code, it takes you to that page. It makes it really easy, really convenient to give. But even if you're going to do that online, would you still fill out this piece of paper? And in a minute, as we begin to worship, I'm asking you to come just set it down here on the stage so we can collect these and we can, like I said, we can plan for the next year on what it is that God is doing. God has been so faithful. Let me say one other thing that I forgot, that if you want to change your giving, you're going to have to do that on the end, and the QR code will tell you how to walk through that and how to change it. But, God has been so faithful to us. We think about those principles. We want to be faithful to Him. We want to be strategic, and we really believe that these 3 ministries are strategic ministries that God is using to accomplish His purpose. And we want to be generous because we believe that God, He loves that. He loves a cheerful giver. We want to be the kind of people who, we're not beholden to money. We want to use what God has given us to bring about His kingdom and be pleasing to Him. And so that's the invitation here this morning, is do you want to cheerfully and gladly support what it is that God is doing? We want you to join us and invite you to join us. So as we begin to worship, if we're going to minister after this, but during this first song of worship, if you come forward and just place that pledge on the stage up here, we'll collect all those at the end of service. So would you stand to your feet and let's worship the Lord.